You're watching Cinepolitics with me, Faiza Ahmed. On today's show, we cast our minds back to the post-war era in Ken Loach's The Spirit of 45. Now, the interwar years had devastated Britain. Deprivation and high unemployment were all too common. And the free market economy was benefiting only the elite. Now, after the end of the war, there was a strong desire to unite and bring about change to rid society of these ills. Now, despite leading Britain to a victory, Winston Churchill was snubbed for Clement Attlee, and Labour's landslide victory led to the creation of the welfare state and nationalisation of industries. Britain looked as though it was on its way up. And that's the spirit of 45 that Loach feels is lost today. Now, shot in black and white, Loach combines archive footage and interviews with political commentators, the likes of Tony Benn, and frontliners from that era. So how did Britain lose the spirit of 45? Let's take a look.
The election was fantastic. During the war, we'd always sat and listened to Winston Churchill on the radio. Everybody did. Everybody sat round the radio and listened to Winston Churchill. And as a kid, I mean, that was it to me. He was the leader, and this was, incredible.
But I say, this is no time to mince measures and fool around with weak governments. Therefore, I say that if you do not give a strong vote to the national and conservative government,
and then suddenly, my family started talking about something quite different. We sat round and my father said they were going to vote Labour.
Newspapers carried the astonishing news to an amazed public. Labour landslide.
On the polling day, I went to Transport House into the little room where we were watching the results, and on the epidioscope we saw all the Conservative seats falling, and it was obviously a landslide. And then the door opened, and out of the bright sunshine into the dark room.
Joining me today to discuss the spirit of 45, we have Chris Banbury, writer and activist, and Maria Duarte, film critic for the Morning Star. Welcome to the show, both of you. Now, Ken Loach is an acclaimed filmmaker who's famous for documenting the plight of the working class. Maria, did this documentary live up to your expectations?
Very much so. I mean, Ken Loach is such a passionate filmmaker, and what you have here is basically a very stirring and rousing documentary, and one that basically appeals or is appealing to the masses to get them stirred up and basically to hold on to the legacy that was started back in 45. It's almost kind of a party political broadcast in a way, and partly a history lesson. Mm-hmm. And he does get his message across fair and square.
Do you think he's championing the spirit of, the people getting together, the unity, or is it Labour's manifesto from 1945?
It's a bit of both, really. It's basically reminding people of what the British people fought for in 45 and what they were aspiring to do and what they set out to do and did actually manage, because this was an amazing programme of reform that the Labour Party accomplished and hasn't been accomplished since. And look at where we are now, it's practically been dismantled. Mm-hmm. It's obscene and horrendous, and I think people should look at this documentary, particularly the beginning of it, where you hear people at that time sort of recounting what was going on, how they felt. They came back to a country where there was no work for them, they lost their sense of purpose, there was a loss of poverty, no housing, mm-hmm. and the Labour Party basically embarked on an incredible housing programme, welfare reform, NHS, it's something that Ken Loach is very passionate about, and I think we should be passionate about to actually save it.
And I think when you watch it, you can't help but draw parallels to contemporary Britain now, especially with the, the economic situation, with the employment. But Chris, I want to know, did you feel the spirit of 1945 in this?
Well, I think it touched a nerve with me because both my parents came home from the Second World War. Both my mother and father were in the armed services, and they both voted Labour in 45 for that government. And I was brought up in a household, a working class household, where I was assured that because of the reforms, the welfare state was introduced, I would not experience the unemployment, the poverty, the war and fascism which they'd experienced in the 1930s. And I was a product of that welfare state, from free milk and orange juice all the way through to free access to university, and that's gone. And from when I'm talking now to a generation of people, a younger generation of people now in Britain, they must be thinking, well, what's he talking about? These things don't exist anymore. And I think what Ken Loach is doing is producing almost a manifesto against the current austerity and saying, look, back in 1945, Britain was bankrupt. And yet it launched this huge council house programme, it launched the National Health Service, it produced these huge reforms. And yet today, when again we're told there's no money, these things have been even more eroded. And this is essentially a story of how this has been eroded under Margaret Thatcher, who's the villainess of the film, obviously. At one point,
he quite clearly blames.
Well, at one point, a miner turns around and says, about the miners' strike, who was it that ordered me to be beaten up? And cuts a picture of Margaret Thatcher.
Delivering her famous speech, the Francis of Assisi.
But I think this is a film, really, you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. And clearly the Daily Mail film critic hated it, calling it Marxist drivel. And I do think, you know, the film is not getting widespread distribution. It's being shown mainly in the art house and in the independent circuit. But I think Loach knew that, and as I understand it, it's been accompanied by question and answer sessions at the end of the film. And I think it's almost kind of like being used as a vehicle to try and generate resistance. So it's quite an active film. It's not just something to go and consume and watch. I think Loach is trying to get across a message and say, actually, if you see this film, you should be doing something. You should be on the streets.
And I think they've set up the website for this film in that way, where you can kind of go get involved with some of the, you know, the online campaigns they've got. But let's pause there. Let's go to our next clip, in which we hear people talk about the creation of the welfare state.
Well, this is the birth of the National Health Service. This is Nye Bevan and the matron Anne Dolan walking from the main building down towards the gate. This said this was handing over the key of the hospital. There wasn't a key handed over, it was just... That was just the way they said the health service was born.
The thing that stands out, sounds so petty this, but we had jam scones for tea. Do you remember that? Each and every one of us. Food was still rationed. We had jam scones for tea. Oh dear God, that's marvellous. I never met the man myself, but I do realise that he was a visionary and he was very, very passionate about this vision of his.
The need at the present time is to build houses for poor people. I am not prepared to associate myself with a policy where well-to-do people can afford to build luxury homes and poor people go without homes.
And his attitude was, nothing but the best is good enough for the working class. We are going to have really good houses, and he built really good houses. The Labour government not only housed people, they housed them well.
I mean, that's just, you know, the whole welfare system was supposed to be from the cradle to the grave. And, you know, today we hear horrific stories about pensioners who have to go out and work to supplement their income. I mean, Chris, why do you think politicians have deviated, especially the Labour Party, deviated away from these policies?
Well, I think you've seen across the globe an acceptance of a neoliberal free market consensus over the last 3 decades. And of course, New Labour under Tony Blair took that up enthusiastically and believed this was the only way to win. And now we see a slight retreat from it. But I mean, really, Labour is committed to austerity at a slightly slower pace. That's all that's here. So I think what Loach is again doing is saying here is a consensus in Britain and indeed the West. And he's made a film to challenge that consensus. So it's quite a bold move, and he's made a film which gives a voice to the people we were just watching who are voiceless. The people who created the National Health Service, who created the welfare state, who built those council homes, and whose lives were affected by it. And yet, fast forward, he then explains what happened in the Thatcher years to put that into reverse. And that's a reverse which has continued relentlessly to the current day. And
do you think that, you know, Thatcher's policies have kind of seeped into, you know, the last Labour government? Obviously, they are still within the Conservative government.
Well, you saw a virtual love affair between Tony Blair and Gordon Brown with Margaret Thatcher. I mean, they were endlessly being filmed with her. Whereas people who actually voted for them in 1997 when they were first elected were doing sort of revulsion against the Tories. The thing that really did for the Tories was the poll tax, which there was a mass rebellion against. And people hated Thatcher at the time. And yet it continued under Tony Blair and Gordon Brown. And it continues, of course, under this current coalition government.
Because Thatcher almost adored Tony Blair. He was almost like her son. And it was true that old Labour was never going to be elected because socialism was a dirty word, you know, and people seem to be more scared of socialists and communists, but not fascists. You know, you can bring them in and that's fine, and that was the major problem. And that's why I think the Labour, I guess, went wrong in that they completely radicalised the party and changed it from what it was. And so instead of being a champion of the working classes, it's now middle classes and upper classes.
I mean, and you can also see that Loach has got a very direct political agenda, which I hope it doesn't put people off from watching this film, but he has issued an appeal for the launching of a sort of united left in Britain, a radical left, drawing a comparison with Syriza, the radical coalition in Greece. So obviously he had this in his mind when he was making this film. There was a political project at work here. Don't let that put you off, please, but there is clear...
Do you think, because, you know, a few critics have said that, you know, as you mentioned earlier, one of the right-wing papers said, you know, it's a Marxist fantasy, and there's some on the other side who've said it's, you know, refreshing and it's almost radical. But do you think because there isn't that balance there, it will lose credibility, or because it's Ken Loach, we'll kind of, you know, put that to the side?
I think people are intelligent enough to make up their own minds, but the fact is, how can it be a Marxist fantasy that, you know, the welfare state was set up in 45, it worked, everyone had free healthcare, the best healthcare that they could possibly have, you know, dentist was free, you know, going to the opticians was free, you know, everyone deserves free healthcare. And now how can you argue with that?
Exactly.
You know?
And now you've got food banks, you know, in Britain that you wouldn't expect to have, people having chips and mayonnaise for dinner.
Well, now you have a generation of people. I mean, anyone on the age of 40, I think it's almost impossible for them to ever own their own home. You have people who are facing precarity in work and precarity in housing, the two most stressful things in your life, incidentally. So there's been a fundamental change. You have to pay to go to university. You leave university with a massive debt, £9,000 a year alone, usually in fees, whereas universities were free when I went.
Me too. I mean, I never paid.
You even got a grant to attend university. I mean, this must sound a bit like a fantasy to some of your viewers, but it was true, and it allowed a whole layer of working class people to go to university. I mean, I was the first person in my family to go to university precisely because it was free. That was a huge change. You know, I remember being brought up in the stories of people in the 1930s ill who could not afford to send for the doctor because they had to pay for the doctor. You know, infant death, all sorts of things. Which
and
were
now
realities.
there's, you know, parts of the NHS that are being privatised. We've got the locums, and well, let's pause there. Let's go to another clip and see another scene from the documentary.
The advertising department seemed to have a heyday because they acquired more staff and they had ladders and buckets of paste and so forth. They were altering everything.
Wages increased under nationalisation. It eventually, in the 1950s, brought about probably the most important industrial agreement in Britain ever negotiated by trade unions, which was an agreement which effectively meant no compulsory redundancies for railway workers.
Without rhythm, a train could never go without rhythm. A crew could never roll without rhythm. The day would never go because rhythm is the thing that makes the world go round. Without rhythm, a poet couldn't rhyme without rhythm. You'd never tell the time.
Okay, so Chris, the nationalisation of the railways, why was that so important?
Well, the railways were bankrupt. I mean, that's why they were nationalised, and they weren't working. And effectively, they had to be taken into state ownership during the war because they weren't running efficiently. One of the great myths, of course, is that the free market is efficient. Well, actually, most of the nationalisations were happening because they could not deliver. Private ownership had failed. So they were nationalised to guarantee that.
And I think one of the other commentators said something quite interesting, that it created jobs for many. And, you know, there were people who were proud to work on the railways, and you don't have that nowadays. And I mean, even with the privatisation, fares go up every year, but the services don't get any better, and it just seems like a monopoly.
And it's very wrong, you know. And when you've got so much youth unemployment, you could, you know, why aren't those people being put into, you know, into better use to work in the railways? Give them some hope, some aspiration, as George Osborne keeps banging on about. There's no excuse, really.
Now, speaking of George Osborne, Chris, did you feel the spirit of 45 in the budget that was delivered?
The exact opposite. And I mean, George Osborne yesterday was saying he was delivering a budget which would provide homes for people. Well, actually he's not, because this is about private ownership. And it's about people buying homes. And you need to have a huge amount of money now to be able to put a deposit down to buy a house, which is why I said for most people under 40 it's never going to happen. The opposite of that, the spirit of 45, was the decision to launch this council house programme of providing free council housing to people in 1945. And it's worth saying, in Glasgow in 1945, half the city's population, families, lived in a one-roomed house, sleeping together in appalling conditions with outside toilets. You know, these lives were changed by people building houses, good houses for working class people. It brought change and it produced jobs. And I kind of wonder why we couldn't do that again now, why we couldn't launch when housing is in desperate shortage, why we couldn't launch a house building programme to provide housing for people at a fair rent. You know, yes, they'll pay something. You know, why couldn't we do that?
Exactly. I mean, he's building 15,000 new homes. Hasn't said where, but 15,000 is a drop in the ocean.
Probably in the southeast of England.
Yeah. But it's nothing. You know.
Yeah, and then they've got the the personal allowance figure, which who is it really benefiting? I mean, you know, when it comes to working mothers. And mothers who want to stay at home, they're being attacked and penalised for, you know, childcare so expensive. So it seems like there's no.
We have the highest childcare in Europe.
I think it's something like 8,000 a year.
It's an incredible amount of money you have to pay if you're not unlucky enough not to get into a free state nursery. And you know, the whole question of education is a scandal in terms of that. But we're seeing benefits being cut back. We yesterday a further extension of a public sector pay freeze. Living standards are falling in this country. You know, this is actually a crisis, going back to Ken Loach's film, which is directly parallel with that of the 1930s. We've not experienced this, any of us in our lifetimes. Not a fall in living standards is something, even Margaret Thatcher did not deliver this.
And Maria,
yet we're seeing it.
Do you think that if we'd possibly heard from other, I guess the other side in this documentary, would have kind of given it more weight? Or
I think it might have done, and also it would have stopped all the critics sort of going on about, oh, this is all terribly partisan, and also, I mean, he goes from 51 to 79 and ignores all the years in between. So that's another thing that, you know, that can be criticised.
And what did you think about the use of the archive? Because he's obviously shot the interviews in black and white as well in it.
I thought that was very effective, to be honest. And to see these people coming back from the war, so hopeful, you know, wanting to rebuild Britain and provide a decent future for their children, and then watching what Thatcher then went and did, which was destroy us all in basically the nanny state, and that's how she got round it, or tried to explain it, that wasn't the role of the government, then it's just really, really sad. I was actually very moved by it, by those black and white pictures, and then at the very end it turns to colour. And it's the same footage that you see at the beginning of people celebrating in Trafalgar Square.
Is that a little, I guess, an indication of a little glimmer of hope? I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, and I hope it can be a glimmer of hope for people and that people take it on board, because it's a very well-made documentary. Loach knows what he's doing. He might have shot himself in the foot by, you know, with the Q&As and setting up a more left-wing party, because people are scared by that. Do you think he's just
trying to create dialogue with that, you know, to engage more people?
Yeah, it's a platform, basically, and it's a shame that more people aren't going to be watching this, because in the clip it said, in the film it said that the elderly should be talking to youngsters to explain what happened, why they fought for the welfare state so hard, and so that they have an idea. And watching that old footage was inspired, really, because it does bring it home very, very much so. And I felt for those people, because I felt that they'd been let down, basically.
Okay, well, let's pause there. Let's go to our final clip and see another scene from the film.
The atmosphere wasn't quite the same this year. For the first time, the management was invited. For this was the first Durham rally since the pits were handed over to the people, and Coal Board representatives took part in the celebrations.
The mines were now owned by the people and run for and on behalf of the people. The elderly miners, obviously, it was their utopia. They'd been promised this since 1919.
Whole country is watching to see how this great new organization, this new adventure, this new experiment comes out. The great experiment of socialism in a democracy depends on you.
Now, Maria, going back to what you were saying, this documentary, who do you think it's going to appeal to?
Like-minded people, basically, that have got the message, and which is fine because it's talking to the converted, but it needs to talk to the whole of Britain, really, and it needs the whole of working class to basically rise up and say, no, enough's enough, you know. The NHS is the last vestige that we've got from 45. Let's not, you know, sell it down the Swanee, basically. We need to save it. We need to preserve it because everybody does deserve to have decent care. And the whole, you know, postcode lottery, why?
Yeah.
Why is that?
And that's
you know,
with some crucial things like cancer treatment.
Yeah.
And Chris, do you think this documentary has got the potential to mobilise the masses?
I think Loach spends a lot of time in Italy, and I think he's aware that the cinema has been used very directly to take films into working class communities, into villages, towns, to show it in halls and so on. As a mobilisation, I'm thinking of a film, particularly 100 Steps, Cento Passi, an anti-mafia film which used, when it was refused distribution, they did that. And I think he's looking to do that. That's why these question and answer sessions. So I think he's very consciously doing something here which is different. He wants to get into working class Britain and try and get across. Whether or not he'll be able to do that, given the monopoly of cinema ownership, is going to be very difficult. But if he could set up showings in community centres, youth clubs, pensioner clubs and so on and so forth, I think that's what he's got in mind. He wants to create that dialogue, and he has issued this appeal. It's there in the film. I think a bit understated, but I think that's no bad thing, actually, because I think, you know, if it was just a clarion call, I think that might just put people off. But it is about trying to mobilise, and he is essentially saying, look, get out on the streets. And it's as crude as that, to be honest. He is saying that. And I think that's the message he's got across. So I think this film is made with that in mind, which is why it doesn't have Tories really defending Margaret Thatcher. It's very consciously a vehicle to mobilise the working people of Britain against what's going on now, austerity and the continued erosion of the welfare state.
So I think so far it's taken something like 225,000, and it's just been open for a week in the UK in 43 cinemas. So Maria, what could you have changed in this?
I don't know. I don't think I would have changed anything, to be honest. It is... Loach had an agenda and he's done it very well. I thought it was quite subtly done, the way he combined both the amazing archive footage with all the current commentators and blended it in so well and effectively. And having sort of normal people talking about their experiences, what it was like then and how their lives have been affected now, I think that kind of speaks for itself. Yeah.
Now, Chris, very quickly, can the spirit of 1945 be revived?
I think it can be, because I think people are looking for these things. I think people, for instance, they want to defend the health service. I think people want free education. It exists in Scotland, so why couldn't it exist in England and Wales?
Plus, I'm sorry, but plus you have free prescriptions in Scotland. Why can't we have it here?
And a better deal for pensioners. So I think there is a possibility of that. But of course, we're talking about, and one of the things which is which does talk about, but really when you see a footage of the mining union marching through Durham, the mining union doesn't exist anymore.
Yes, so I guess
and the trade unions are much weaker.
Is raising all these points, and it's in the cinemas. If people are keen to watch it, or they can visit the website. That's all we've got time for today, so we're going to have to stop there. Thank you to both my guests, and of course to all of you at home. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can do so by emailing us at cinepolitics@presstv.co.uk, or you can join our Facebook fan page. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.